Today's video is inspired by a similar video that FineOK made, who was sharing his experience on PTS, and I wanted to share mine as well. I will link everything about him later in the video, so you can go check him out, and you should absolutely subscribe to him because I think he's a wonderful person and also the premier source for any solo lane related information in SMITE now. So today we're talking about what I learned from the PTS, from the mid-season patch, and what I expect is going to happen and how the meta is going to develop based on what I've seen so far and some further interpretation. And obviously for me it's not so much from a solo lane perspective, but rather from a jungle and support perspective, as well as touching on the other roles as well. Before we get into the specific roles, some general points that apply for everyone. The jungle shrine is now a massively rewarding objective in terms of gold, with that being doubled and you're only having to hit the camp once. I think at the moment it's honestly a bit too much gold. It's 10 gold per camp, and that adds up because it's 50 gold per camp for the entire team, which really accelerates the item farm overall. I can see how this would help teams when they're behind and everything, so there is a purpose to that, but at the same time I think it's just a little bit over the top in how it functions at the moment, and I personally am still not a fan of the concept of the jungle shrine in general. One of the various jungle changes was that the Gold Fury variations were changed and mostly made harder, and now have less solo potential as well as are harder to kill as a team, and it's easier to punish you when you try to kill it, and this is especially a problem for ADCs trying to solo it as well. I expect the Gold Fury and especially its other variations to be a much less contested objective overall, because it's just riskier to do than beforehand and you can get punished so easily. And instead, I think players are going to turn more towards structures. Structures are going to be easier to destroy because percentage pen is now on various physical items and it will apply to structures. So I see us going more towards a lane push meta where people stay in lane longer and try to push structures down, or maybe a split push meta, because that is going to be a lot more rewarding. And while this doesn't sound like a general point, RATATOSKR is going to be everywhere, at least until he gets some more nerfs. I think he's going to be played in support, in solo, in jungle, maybe even in mid or ADC. I could see all of that happening because he is very potent in various different ways right now, which is interesting obviously, but I think they'll need some fine-tuning in the long run. And that brings us to the specific roles. The first one is mid. Mid arguably has the smallest changes compared to the other roles because really not that much has changed for them. What most mid laners cannot do as easily anymore is solo red buff at the beginning of the game. The frenzy form that it has at low HP is just dishing out a little bit too much damage for most mages to cope with in early stages. And speaking of mages, one item change that happened for mages is Spear of the Magus, so that might affect which cards we'll actually see in mid lane. I think the new Spear of the Magus is a lot more interesting for a lot of picks, I would say almost all mages. And we might also see the return of stacking mages more and see them being more potent, like for example Kukulkan, because the stacking items were changed a lot as well. Through the item changes, there's also definitely more potential for ability-based ADCs to come back into middle lane. I could see a lot of them being picked there, and we could possibly see a bit of a return to the double ADC meta, with the second one being in mid. When it comes to support, we don't have massive changes to the playstyle itself, because really there are some minor tweaks to the Harpy and to the Void buff, but I don't think they will majorly impact how the lane is played most of the time. For those supports who were previously occasionally soloing camps in the jungle, that is going to be a fair bit harder because those are buffed and it takes longer with the tank, and usually it's not worth it, I would say, in many situations now. There's also the Height of Nemean line change, which could have some interesting implications. It could push Athena back into the meta potentially. It could also mean that certain guards are a fair bit easier to counter support, whereas especially crit builds will be harder to counter. Likewise, the changes to physical penetration will generally mean, in my opinion, that tanks are about to take at least a fair bit more damage. Well, the damage from late game hunters will not necessarily change all too much depending on how much physical defense you have exactly. Especially the late game damage from assassins should be a fair bit higher because in many situations before we didn't even see them go into Titan's Bane, and now they may have more of a reason to go into different pen items, and that is something, or percentage pen items, and that is something that you will feel as a support. In ADC, we see significant changes. The laning meta itself won't really be affected heavily, there's not really anything that changes here, but it may still change due to the popularity of certain picks changing, so that could have an overall impact on how the lane is played anyways. There are some specific item changes that I saw in effect in multiple PTS games that really made a difference. One of them is Atalanta's bow, which is likely going to be very, very dominant, potentially being like the core item instead of Executioner for penetration and for everything else. And that'll potentially lead to a more aggressive playstyle because this item rewards you for going in aggressively. But unless your support stays in lane very long, it only becomes effective once you get to the teamfight stage, so it's not going to be a massive issue while laning, I think. Another item that might be more impactful while laning is Berserker's Shield, because it actually has a lot of good stats for ADCs now, but also comes with some physical defense along with that. And it could potentially happen that we kind of run into a bit of a Berserker's Shield meta. Not sure yet, but I have seen it being used on PTS and it did its job, most certainly. Executioner, on the other hand, is probably dead because there's really not much of a reason to pick it over other items at this point, in my opinion, which also indirectly nerfs physical supports, which will not get the benefit of the protection reduction from that in later stages of the game. So yeah, a minor thing to keep in mind here. I think we could potentially see ability-based hunters coming back big time. I already made a video about that, you can check that out if you want to. And on the other hand, I could also see basic attack focused mages make a return, because Ring of Hecate is changed entirely and could be a lot more interesting for certain AA mages around mid-game. But at the same time, crit items also got changes, which means they could be more interesting, especially with no Height of the Nemean line reflecting them back at you. So really every potential build path for ADCs got buffed in some way. It's going to be very interesting to see which one is going to be the dominant one, but I'm definitely expecting some overall shifts in the meta here, even though Heimdall will probably still be very, very strong, unfortunately. And that brings us to my original home, and that is jungle. As I already titled one of my videos, jungle actually feels fun now. It feels very different, and I personally like it a lot better than what it was before. The camps are feeling very different. You have to interact with them more, so to speak. You have to pay attention to what exactly they're doing, and they are also tankier. So you can't necessarily always just go for a quick heal on a camp, because sometimes that can actually lead to you dying, because they might just be a bit too tanky at that point, do a bit too much damage. There's just different stats behind them. The XP, the farm in jungle, is either equal to the current patch or less. I think overall from what I saw on PTS, it was actually less most of the time, and the jungles were actually a fair bit behind, unless they got a massive amount of snowball and a massive amount of kills, really. So I think that may have to be adjusted, or you have to pick junglers that just rely on items more than on levels, so to speak. Aggressive camps also mean that certain plays are harder to do, like you can't blink as easily in the jungle. It is harder to lazy back in some situations, or it's harder to hide in a camp without causing any sort of noise around you, so that's gonna change certain situations. And Assassin's Blessing also stacks slightly slower, and that's because blue buff now spawns ghost minions, and these ghost minions do not give you any stacks for Assassin's Blessing, so you only get one stack from clearing the entire blue buff, which is a very minor downside in the bigger picture of things, but I figured it was worth noting. Various item changes affect junglers as well, much like they did with ADCs, which primarily means two things. On one hand, high burst junglers, or high burst ultimate junglers, will get significant benefits from the new Titan's Bane, as well as being able to utilize Soul Eater if they have big AoEs, so that is going to be interesting. But what's going to be even more interesting is basic attack focused assassins. They especially benefit from Serrated Edge, but also various other item changes, and I think they are going to be a whole lot stronger overall, and might actually be the ones dominating the meta. So far it actually looks like they might be very, very potent overall. We've seen a lot of PTS games where AA assassins were really a driving force, so that's going to be very interesting. And last but not least, we have solo lane, at least briefly. Solo lane is most certainly more gankable than before, because there's just generally less sustain in there due to the removal of, or change of Berserker's Shield and Gladiator's Shield, and that obviously has an impact on both junglers as well as solo, but in my opinion it makes the lane more interesting because you have to play around that as well. You have to play a little bit safer in some situations now. This also means that we might see a shift in certain items, especially when it comes to sustain. Stone of Gaia or maybe even Soul Eater might make a return. They definitely look a lot more appealing now, also because both of them were changed anyways. Now, like I said, FineOK made a video about solo specifically, which I will link in just a second. But what I wanted to say from that video, basically, one of the conclusions that he had that is potentially possible that Guardians and Mages may make more of a return to solo lane. And that made me curious, and I actually reached out to FineOK. Because in his video he briefly talked about Golden Blade and how he thought that was not worth it. And I asked him if that was for Warriors or in general. And he answered that it was for Warriors specifically that he was thinking of there. My reason for asking this is because I thought there is actually a good chance that basic attack focused assassins, primarily those with built-in sustain, so Bakasura, Arachne and Kali a little bit, would have a decent chance to actually make it into solo lane with the new patch. And he responded, I can definitely see that, to be honest. I was messing around with Shredded Edge and Berserker's Shield and they are kinda crazy good, just not great for Warriors. Only issue that I see with picking the assassins like that is them picking pressure warriors to punish you like Osiris and Bellona and such, but I think it might actually be a thing. Good shout. So there you have it from the man himself. I think it's really cool. I think there's definitely interesting potential there. And as somebody who used to almost exclusively run Bakasura solo in Season 1, I would be very excited if this could happen. It's especially interesting because the bully guards that he mentioned also don't have quite the same strength to bully out AA assassins as they used to, because back when that was the biggest issue was primarily when they had Death Toll and they also had Galatial or Berserker Shield later. So, of course, they still have very strong bully potential against AA assassins, but it's just a few picks and they're not quite as super dominant in that regard as they used to be. So I think we could see a very, very, very interesting solo meta if that happens, where we really have a competition between Warriors, Guardians, Assassins and Mages, maybe. So it could be a whole rock, paper, scissors thing in terms of picks that might happen there, and I think that's super exciting. I think that's the solo lane that I would personally want to see. Well, last but not least, some solos may also be able to solo the new blue buff later, specifically those that have more single target damage, which aren't that many, but just a little side note there, really. And that is all from me for today, so if you enjoyed this video, feel free to hit the sub button and maybe the bell if you want to stay updated for future SMITE content, especially breaking this down in more detail. But also, please go check out FineOK and subscribe to him. I will link the video that I referred to here above or on the side somewhere. You'll definitely see it somewhere on the screen, so you can check it out for yourself and you get some more detailed info, more specific info on solo lane, which I definitely think is worth checking out. FineOK has really been putting in the work for a long time now, and I highly recommend watching him. And other than that, I'll see you for the next one soon. ZiSotto, out.